Hi, I'm Fred from the Photobug, and today I'm going to discuss camera aperture, what it is, and how it affects exposure. Let's start with what is an aperture. Well, an aperture is a part of the camera lens that works as a variable portal to control the amount of light that enters the camera body. In modern cameras, the aperture is made up of blades of metal or plastic that can open and close as necessary. Since the size of the opening is important to control the amount of light that gets through, the aperture is measured in f-stops. F-stops can be very confusing to beginning photographers, since the larger numbers represent smaller openings. Let me explain why. The f number is actually a fraction. It is the ratio of the focal length of the lens to the diameter of the aperture. The f in the f number stands for focal length. We could call that a 1 at the top part of a fraction. The number, therefore, is a denominator, or the bottom number of a fraction. For example, in a 100 millimeter lens, if the aperture is set at f2, that means the opening is 50 millimeters, or 1/2 of the focal length. An aperture of f8 is 1/8 the focal length, or in the example that we're showing, 12.5 millimeters. Just remember that the fact that the aperture is a fraction, and it will help you from having too many problems in figuring out that, hey, f16 is much smaller than an f2.8. Therefore, an f16 will not admit as much light as the lower number. It is also to remember that as f numbers increase, each f-stop reduces the amount of light by 1/2. F numbers are listed as you can see here. As we go from f1 to f32 from top to bottom of our list, each stop reduces the amount of light by 50%. As we go back up from the bottom from f32 to f1, each stop doubles the amount of light that enters the camera. This is an important concept in understanding exposure, so be sure to remember this. Every lens has a maximum aperture or f-stop opening that is marked somewhere on the front of the lens. An f2.8 lens can only open to an f2.8 aperture. An f4 lens can only open to an f4 aperture. The reason for this is the physical diameter of the lens. Lenses that have larger openings, remember, that's the smaller f numbers, are often referred to as faster lenses since they can admit more light. These lenses are normally more expensive due to the larger diameter lenses that are required to build them. You may notice on your zoom lenses that there are two f numbers listed. For example, f3.5 to f5.6. Remember, the f number is a measure of the ratio of the diameter of the aperture opening to the focal length of the lens. If this diameter opening doesn't change when the lens is at its smallest focal length, the ratio is larger than when the lens is zoomed to the largest focal length. Therefore, over the range of the zoom, the ratio must change, even though the size of the aperture doesn't. So in our example, when the lens is zoomed back to its smallest focal length, the effective aperture is 3.5, when it's open to its maximum f number. So when the lens is zoomed to the longest focal length, the aperture size remains the same, but the ratio is smaller, so now it's effectively f5.6. Zoom lenses that have a fixed maximum f number change the size of the aperture opening throughout the zoom to keep the ratio the same at all the focal lengths. So, taking the variable f-stop zoom lens, such as our example of the f3.5 to 5.6, just remember that when you are zoomed all the way out, you need to be at the widest aperture, which is the f3.5. Then as you zoom in on whatever your subject is, the ratio will change as it creeps towards that f5.6. However, if I take that same lens and start it at a different aperture, such as f8, f16, something like that, as I zoom in on what my subject is, the ratio is not going to change because I'm already beyond the maximum aperture. I'm at an f8 or f16 instead of the f3.5. So this you have to remember when you're setting up for zooming and want to keep your f-stops variating properly. Now, on lenses that have fixed f numbers, such as a Canon 24 to 105 f4, what happens is that the f number changes the size of the aperture opening throughout the zoom to keep the ratio the same at all focal lengths. Now, let's talk about aperture priority. Cameras have two semi-automatic modes that allow the photographer to choose two of the three settings from our exposure triangle. There is shutter priority mode, where the photographer chooses the ISO and the shutter speed, and the camera automatically sets the aperture. And there is aperture priority mode, where the photographer chooses the ISO and the aperture, and the camera sets the shutter speed. Let's talk about the aperture priority model. On most cameras, the dial is marked with an A to indicate aperture priority. On certain brands, such as Canon's, the dial is marked AV, which stands for aperture value. We tend to use aperture priority 90 to 95% of the time, and that's true for me also. It's one of my favorite settings, since the aperture also controls the depth of field in the final image. When we use smaller apertures, such as f/16 or f/22, we achieve a much greater depth of field. This means that items in the front or behind of the focus subject at any particular focal length are more likely to be in focus. But if we want that nice blurred background, also called bokeh from a Japanese word, we want to use a larger aperture opening or a smaller f-stop. The ability to choose how much of our captured scene is in focus is important as a creative choice, and that's why we tend to use aperture priority much of the time. Also be aware that the focal length of the lens also affects the overall depth of field, and that will be taken up in a future video. So let's summarize. F-stops are the ratio of the focal length of the lens to the diameter of the aperture opening. Smaller numbers represent bigger aperture diameters. As we go up the f-stop scale, each stop emits half the amount of light, and as we go down the scale, each stop emits twice as much light. All lenses have a maximum aperture opening or f-stop, and most zooms are marked with 2 f-stop ranges. The aperture priority mode allows a photographer to choose the f-stop and ISO, and the camera selects the shutter speed. The aperture affects the depth of field of an image. Smaller aperture openings have a larger depth of field. If you don't understand any of these summary points, please go back and review the video until you do understand them. So thank you for watching. If you have comments or questions, be sure to leave them below this video, and please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future videos.